also some macroeconomics. Roll up our intellectual sleeves. So we're in the process of discussing how macroeconomists tend to think about the business cycle, and we are doing so through the lens of the theory of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And just to recap, the way the business cycle works is as follows. We have that the price level and real GDP are both jointly determined by the interaction of supply and demand at the aggregate level. We have that we gravitate towards a situation of long-run equilibrium, which looks like this. However, as we discussed, there's a whole catalog of things that might affect the position of the aggregate demand curve, so that while we may gravitate towards this situation, there are also forces that tend to knock us away from it. Whether it's things that increase aggregate demand, which would then lead us to be in an inflationary gap, or things that decrease aggregate demand and lead us to be in a recessionary gap. So, let's just pick one of them. Let's imagine that something happened that has pushed us into a recessionary gap. Again, there could be lots of things that do that. It could be, for some reason, income abroad decreased, the value of the currency increased, animal spirits, if you're Keynesian persuasion, and so on and so on and so on. So that's the first part of the business cycle. What we discussed last week was that if you leave this economy alone and just let things evolve by themselves, there are forces that lead you back into long-run equilibrium. What's going on here when the recessionary gap opens is that as demand decreases, equilibrium prices go down. And the reason we deviate from long-run equilibrium is because there is one price that doesn't go down with the others, that's the wage. And so in this situation, we have that real wages are higher than normal, and by normal in this context we mean the long run. And of course that is precisely what means that suppliers don't want to produce as much, inputs are expensive, so they would rather produce less, it's not as profitable to produce as much. And indeed, the higher wages may even lead some of the producers to be shutting down altogether, in which case those workers are let go. But since the real wage is, in that sense, too high, sooner or later, the labor market will adjust to those higher wages. There are more people unemployed, which means that worker bargaining power is weakened, and so sooner or later the wages start to drop along with the other prices. Of course, once the wages start to drop, your micro spidey senses should be saying, well, a decline in wages is a decline in costs, a decline in costs increases supply. And so you would get a new supply curve eventually. That of course leads us to this new equilibrium point here where we are back in long-run equilibrium. That's the summary of how the business cycle works in our theory. However, as we discussed, some economists aren't okay with just letting these forces, these economic forces, deal with the business cycle by themselves. Because for the period of time where we are, in this example, in a recessionary gap, back here, people are experiencing economic pain. Right? First of all, since real GDP has gone down, we know that on average, income has gone down for people. Right? There is some redistribution. Some people have jobs where they're getting a higher real wage, but they're at greater risk of unemployment. And this whole bunch of unemployed people that wouldn't have been unemployed otherwise. So this isn't a good situation. And furthermore, especially if you're Keynesian, you would think that a situation like this could persist indefinitely, potentially. Because again, if you're Keynesian, you think that once things start turning bad, then people, the animal spirits arise, people think that, people's outlook is negative, and their negative outlook means they spend less, which of course makes matters worse, or certainly doesn't, just keeps you there. So, whether you're Keynesian or not, there are many economists who think that in a situation like this, rather than waiting for the self-correcting mechanism to do its job, instead it would be good for, broadly, someone to do something about it. In particular, for the government to do something about it. So, the government's trying to push the economy back to long-run equilibrium rather than waiting for self-correcting mechanisms to kick in is something we're going to refer to as stabilization policy. And to see how it is that governments might be able to affect the macroeconomy, consider that, remember that aggregate demand has the following components. Aggregate demand is consumption plus investment plus government spending. Hey, there's the government! Plus exports minus imports. There's something that the government controls, government spending. So, stabilization policy would be something like, well, when a recessionary gap opens, why doesn't the government increase government spending to push the aggregate demand curve back where it would have been otherwise? So that's an example of stabilization policy. Broadly, well, that's one way in which the government might be able to push things back. But it turns out that government spending isn't the only way in which the government might be able to affect aggregate demand. And to remind you of that, the first time we talked about things that the government controls that might affect aggregate demand was before we talked about government spending. The first thing we talked about when we talked about consumption, which came first in our discussion, was the fact that consumption depends on disposable income. Let's call it DI for short. And of course, what's disposable income is income plus transfers minus taxes. So, if disposable income is that, and that determines how much you can consume, notice that these things, the transfers and the taxes, are also under the control of the government. So, in principle, the government has three things that it controls that it could use to affect aggregate demand. And in this case, push the aggregate demand back rather than waiting for the self-correcting mechanism. So maybe I should write them up on the board. what can the government do? And in this situation, where we have a recessionary gap to try and push the demand curve back, there are three things. One, as discussed, it could increase government spending. But there are these other options that are more indirect. Two, it could use its power over transfers and taxes to boost disposable income. If it increases transfers, then it's increasing consumption, and that will boost aggregate demand. There's another one. Another tool, stabilization policy. And there's a third one, taxes. Taxes have a minus sign, so if you wanted to boost spending, you would want to lower taxes. And depending on which tax you lower, that could boost consumption or investment. And so, cutting taxes might be a way of trying to, well, what would you be doing here? And you're trying to boost spending, in other words, you're trying to push this thing back where it came from. So in principle, that's the idea of stabilization policy. To be precise, stabilization policy comes in two flavors. What we're talking about now is stabilization policy by using the things that are on the government budget. Its spending, its transfers, and its income, its taxes. And so stabilization policy of that kind is called fiscal policy. There is another flavor of stabilization policy which doesn't have to do with the government budget. Instead, it has to do with the Fed's control over interest rates, over the quantity of money, and over the financial system more broadly. And that is monetary policy. So today, we're going to talk about the ins and outs of fiscal policy, and on the assumption we extinguish that topic today, on Wednesday we'll talk about monetary policy. Well, I guess we'll start talking about monetary policy, because monetary policy turns out to be fairly a more complicated topic than fiscal policy. In particular, since, I guess, around 2008, the Fed has been doing a lot of things with monetary policy that it didn't do before. So the world of monetary policy has become broader, more complicated, and I guess also more interesting. So you may end up spending more time talking about monetary policy. All right? So that's the broad idea of fiscal policy, using government, spending, taxes, and transfers to try and push the demand curve back where it was supposed to. And of course, we're talking about this for a recessionary gap. If this were an inflationary gap, we just switch the direction of all these arrows. Okay? Any questions, comments, or thoughts about the basic logic? So the next thing we want to discuss is the fact that there is debate among economists about the desirability and effectiveness of fiscal policy. So to do that, I'm going to review some things we discussed before, maybe add some meat to them, under a heading I'm going to call concerns. So these are concerns that economists raise about, again, the desirability or effectiveness of fiscal policy, which on the face of it seems like a straightforward thing, about which you wouldn't have much debate about. So the first concern, continuing with the vein of talking about economic theory, is that if the government does any of these three things, it necessarily has to borrow more, right? The only way in which, well, the alternative, I guess, would be suppose the government decides to change fiscal policy by increasing government spending. It could pay for it by raising taxes, but if it does that, of course, it's giving with one hand and taking away with the other, so it's not going to work. So for any of these to be effective, really, the government would need to be borrowing. And so one concern has to do with thinking about, well, what is the impact this is going to have on the market for borrowing? Well, let's represent that market for borrowing. We have a name for it. It's the market for loanable funds, where the cost of borrowing $1 or the reward to lending $1 is the interest rate. So, there is a demand curve here, which is made up of you and me, whenever we need to borrow and finance our spending, as well as all the companies out there that need funds to pay their workers in the short run or to expand their businesses or whatever it is that they're doing. And then there's the supply, which I referred to earlier as the savings supply. Right? These are funds that people don't have an immediate use for, and thus they're willing and able to lend it. And it's important to remember that this term savings supply masks the fact that the banking system plays an important role in helping get these funds to the borrowers. So, to the extent that you and I save by having cash in our wallet or under our mattress, that isn't going to borrowers. To the extent that you put money in the banks and the banks hold them as reserves, that's also going to borrowers. So, whatever our savings are, the banking system actually plays an important role in bringing that to the borrowers. So that means the savings supply is also increased and decreased depending on what banks are doing and what the Fed is doing. So that's important to keep in mind for later in our discussion. Anyway, the whole point of the loanable funds market was that the interest rates and the quantity of loanable funds exchanged depends on the demand for loanable funds and the supply of savings as interpreted by the banking system. Now, suppose the Fed does one of these, suppose the government does one of these things. You could pick one of them. Let's just say they increase government spending because they're trying to close the gap. Well, now suddenly the government is competing with everyone else for these loanable funds, right? They have to borrow. They have to borrow from somewhere. They have to borrow from the market for loanable funds. So now they've just increased the demand for these loanable funds. And what does that do? Well, it increases the supply of loanable funds because it's increasing the equilibrium interest rates. But what is it doing to everyone else who's in this market? Well, everyone else who's in this market is represented by this old line here. So the higher interest rates means that demand for loanable funds by everyone else has been discouraged. So when the government stimulates by, in this example, increasing government spending, it's raising interest rates, which then lowers either consumption or investments, whatever it is that the other borrowers were borrowing for. So that effect, whereby an increase in government spending raises interest rates, which drives down, increases the cost of borrowing and thus drives down to some degree consumption or investment, we refer to as crowding out. Right, so that's the first concern. Economists disagree on how severe the crowding out problem is. Now, one way in which people sometimes think about crowding out, which is a shorthand, is to say, well, there's this fixed pool of funds out there that we can borrow from, and well, when the government does any of these things, it's just taking a chunk out of it so that there's less left over for everyone else. That's not quite right, because when the government borrows, it pushes up interest rates, which does make the size of this pie a bit bigger. The point is that because the savings supply is upward sloping, it's never going to be enough to satisfy the borrowing needs of everyone else. So everyone else is borrowing, and thus spending will be eroded. Okay? Any questions or comments about crowding out? Now, there's a second concern here. I talked about government spending so far, but let's think about taxes and transfers. A dollar in government spending is a dollar spent. It has this crowding out problem, but think about a dollar in transfers or a dollar in taxes. An extra dollar in transfers or a dollar less, I guess, in taxes is a dollar more or less in disposable income. Disposable income isn't spending. So with taxes and transfer changes, there's an extra step here, which is, well, what are the people going to do with this extra disposable income? And so if there is, if the government tries to push the aggregate demand curve back, and it does so, let's say, by increasing transfers to me, maybe they send me a stimulus check, that's what they've been doing in recent years. What if I don't spend that check? What if I instead use it to add to my savings? Or what if I use it to pay off credit card debt? That's not spending. So, I guess the second concern, particularly regarding taxes and transfers, and I guess to be precise, I should say taxes down and transfers up, may not be spent. Or they may be spent on something unproductive. So there's an interesting study by one of the other professors here at GW called Steve Hamilton, where he did the following. Actually, it's a pretty unique study. What happened is in 2020, as you know, the university went online because COVID came along and made a mess of everyone's lives. And Steve Hamilton, my colleague, went to Australia and then couldn't leave because the way Australia dealt with COVID was by shutting the borders so that no cases could get in and no cases would go. Well, no one would get out. If you go out, you wouldn't be able to come back. If there are no inbound flights, there are no outbound flights. So they shut down the entire country, basically. And so my colleague was stuck there for 2 years. course, if life gives you lemons, you should make lemonade. So what did he do when he was stuck in Australia for 2 years? He became an important element of an important participant in the debates in Australia about how to deal with the economic fallout of COVID. Because what happened with COVID? Suddenly no one is going to restaurants, suddenly no one is going to take flights, no one is going on holidays and cruises, so big collapse in spending. You may recall the US unemployment rate spiked to something like 10% at that time, and that understates the negative impact because a lot of people also dropped out of the labor force to take care of family members who were sick and so on. So it was a disaster here, it was a disaster in Australia. And what did the Australian government do? The Australian government did the following. In Australia, everyone has a mandatory pension plan, where part of your income has to be added by law to your pension account. So what the Australian government did was they said, in order to deal with COVID, anyone who wants to is allowed to withdraw early up to 20,000 Australian dollars from these accounts. And do whatever. So, stimulus. And so my colleague Steve Hamilton, what did he do? He managed to obtain data on everyone in Australia, whether or not they withdrew funds, how much they withdrew, and what they did with it. Fascinating stuff. So, first of all, about 6% of the population withdrew funds early from their pension accounts. Second, those who withdrew maxed out. In other words, those who withdrew all 20,000. An Australian dollar is not far off a US dollar, I think, so that's roughly 20,000 US dollars. And third, those who withdrew it more or less immediately, like within 3 weeks they'd withdrawn all the $20,000. Which on the face of it sounds like, wow, that's an effective stimulus, right? It got used up immediately. But then the question is, what did people do with their funds? So, what do you think was the first, as in the most common use of these withdrawals? Yeah. Sorry? Buying what? Nope. Yeah.
Paying off debt?
Turns out that was the third most common. So, to the extent that they're using it to pay off debt, and evidently if it's the third most common use, that means it's a common use. That's not stimulated, right? Yeah.
Invested?
No. The most common use was, you have an idea? Sorry?
Luxury.
The answer is we don't know, because the most common use was cash withdrawals. And apparently this was mainly young people doing the cash withdrawals. So we don't actually know what they did with it, except that, why would you withdraw cash? Like, do you ever use cash? Why would you withdraw cash? We don't want anyone knowing what you're doing with it. So that's a bit sus, but anyway. What's the second most common use of these withdrawal funds? Gambling. Is gambling going to boost aggregate demand? I don't know, I guess it depends on what the casino does with the money. Well, it's not casinos, but in Australia, basically everywhere they have one-armed bandits. Apparently 80% of Australians are active gamblers. So like you go into a 7-Eleven, there's going to be a one-armed bandit there. They call them pokies, so. Sounds like Australia's a fun place. Anyway, so all that goes to suggest that taxes and transfers may not be that effective because, again, people may use it to pay credit card debt, they may use it to save, or they may not be doing anything too productive with it. And I guess that opens up a broader question, which is, when it comes to government spending, okay, that doesn't have to go through this question of what are the people going to do with the money that you give them, because you're spending directly on something. But maybe it raises the question, just as the question is here, when you give people cash through transfers or tax reductions, what do they do with them? That raises the question of, well, when you increase government spending, what is it spent on? There are very different things that the government does. For example, do they spend it on building bridges? Do they spend it on building missiles? Do they spend it on research and development? All of those should have a different impact. When there was a big increase in government spending in 2008, 2009 to deal with the financial crisis, the government made a point of directing that towards R&D. And you might say, well, R&D is great, it pays off in the long run, right? So it's stimulating in the short run, but it also pays off in the long run. But other instances of stimulus came down in a different direction. Say maybe fixing bridges, or usually they have something in mind for the long run. If you're a Keynesian, on the other hand, you actually don't care so much about the details. If you're a Keynesian, you think, well, the whole point of stabilization policy is that you kill the animal spirits. Right? If you're pushing back, remember the whole idea of recessions in a Keynesian perspective is that people became pessimistic for one reason or another, and so that's what actually the pessimism itself causes the recession. It's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. The government is there pushing back with fiscal policy, then it kills the animal spirits. The fear may not even develop in the first place, and so thus the details don't really matter that much. But in any case, not everyone is a Keynesian, and even so, I think it's a useful discussion. Thinking about exactly how is this government spending framed. Any questions, comments, or thoughts? And that actually brings up an additional problem, because the fact is, suppose we're in a recessionary gap, the government has to figure out what it's going to do. Which one of these three, or what mix of the three, and they also have to figure out the details. What exactly are we going to spend on? Which transfer are we going to cut? Which taxes are we going to, which transfer are we going to increase? Which taxes are we going to cut? And who makes that decision? The government. But who is the government? Let's take different countries have different systems, but let's take the United States, since we're here. Who is the government here? Let's just go with the federal government. Well, it has several parts. But which is the part that determines these things? It's Congress. The president has to sign off on anything, but Congress is the entity that passes laws, including deciding government spending, taxes, and transfers. So, what's Congress? It's two houses. There's the Senate and there's the House of Representatives. And who are they? Well, they're people that you elected to be there. So, let's take an example. What's your hometown? Sorry? Spain, okay. You don't have a representative here, sorry. How about you?
New Jersey.
New Jersey, okay. So you are the representative from whatever congressional district in New Jersey. So what's your job in Congress? Exactly, to represent and advocate for the benefit of the people in your district. And what's your hometown? Pennsylvania. So what's your job? Right, exactly. So now we, Congress, have realized that there's a recessionary gap, which sucks for the people in New Jersey and Pennsylvania because there's unemployment and so on. And so your job is to try and push back against these conditions. And let's say you've agreed that we're going to increase government spending. So what do you think we should spend the extra government spending on? Representative of New Jersey. Yeah. So what should we do with the extra government spending? What should we spend it on? Infrastructure where? In New Jersey, right? It's your job to direct funding towards your district. But what do you think we should do? Right, exactly. You're not going to agree, right? By design, you're there representing different people. And you could say, well, naturally, if you think about, so there are two issues. One is your job is to represent different people. Second, if you think about politicians, they're just there for their own benefit, it's a job, they get paid, but they want to get reelected. And what's going to help them be reelected? Advocating for them, or showing that they're advocating for the interests of their people. So even if they're self-interested, they still have some interest in disagreeing because they're representing different people. So it takes time to actually change government spending, taxes, or transfers. So this isn't a theoretical thing, this is more of a practical issue, but just by the nature of how the decisions are made, it may be slow. And this slowness isn't just academic. I have an article to show you, well, I guess a headline, which is from a long time ago. This has to do with a recession from 2001, 2002. So there were two things going on that caused a recessionary gap back then. One was there was a big collapse in tech stocks, which eroded wealth and thus lowered consumption. The second one was 9/11. That really didn't help. So there was a recessionary gap. The Congress got together, the people from New Jersey, the representatives from New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and so on, discussed what to do and finally agreed that they wanted to increase government spending. And what does it say here? This is from March 8th, 2022. It says, House passes recovery bill. What does it say here? Fed chief sees decline over. In other words, the delay in the representatives and senators and so on agreeing on, first of all, whether or not something should be done, like are we even in a recessionary gap? And then second, actually agreeing on what to do about it. That delay was so long that by the time they agreed, the decline's over. So it was pointless. I have another article here, not that, this one. This is an academic paper, not an article from the New York Times. So this isn't news, this is research. From around the same time, actually. And the title of this research paper is, Has Fiscal Policy Helped Stabilize the Post-War US Economy? Because what I just described suggests that fiscal policy might stabilize the economy. But it might not if there are all these delays involved. It could even make things worse if you imagine, right? If it's always late, then it's actually adding uncertainty to the economy, not helping. And this professor finds, I consider whether post-war fiscal policies help stabilize the US economy. Blah, 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 blah. I find that fiscal policy in general provides little stability. So this is a serious concern. Now there is a last thing that's interesting that I'm going to turn to in a second, which says, I also find that the endogenous feedback links can provide some stabilization. What is he talking about? Let's get to that. The concern about the effectiveness of stabilization policy, fiscal policy in particular, due to delays, had to do with the fact that it takes time to actually purposefully change any of these three things, right? But what if there are aspects of the government budget that change automatically whenever something like a recessionary gap opens? What do I mean by that? Well, consider the fact that, well, what's characteristic about a recessionary gap? We have that income has decreased relative to potential GDP, right? So, if we have income decreasing relative to potential GDP, that means on average, everyone's income has gone down. Now, there's something special about the way the United States tax system is set up. It's actually not true everywhere. And that is that if you have higher and higher income, what happens to your tax rate? It goes up. It's referred to as the progressive tax system. So what happens if we fall into a recessionary gap? Well, on average, people's incomes are lower, which means many people's tax rates have gone down. In other words, without anyone having to make any decision, as a recessionary gap opens, because of the progressive tax system, taxes go down. And so there's some sort of automatic stabilization happening just because of the way the tax system is set up. So any such aspect of the tax transfer system or government spending system that, without anyone having to make a decision, adjusts in the direction we would want with respect to stabilization policy is called an automatic stabilizer. What are other examples of automatic stabilizers? Well, one was the progressive tax system. Another is the fact that when a recessionary gap opens, one of the things that we were discussing that's in the background here is that since firms aren't producing as much, they don't need as many workers, so more people are fired, fewer people are hired, and the unemployment rate generally goes up. Well, how do people make ends meet when they're unemployed? Well, they draw on savings, maybe they borrow, and they receive unemployment benefits. So, to the extent that there's an unemployment benefit system in place, whenever there's a recessionary gap, transfers go up automatically without anyone having to decide anything, just because more people get to become eligible to draw on those, on that form of transfer. Another form of transfers that we discussed before, food stamps. What are food stamps? Food stamps are transfers to households who are poor to make sure that their poverty doesn't impact their nutrition. So, again, we have incomes going down, probably then more people falling into poverty, more people becoming eligible for food stamps, and thus, again, automatically, as it were, transfers go up. So, when Professor Jones, whose paper we just had a look at, said something about endogenous feedback links providing some stabilization, this is what he means. He means there's some evidence that automatic stabilizers work. Okay? even though he finds that overall fiscal policy doesn't. Why? Again, we saw the delays, and there could be some bickering involved that slows things down, and maybe even means that whatever spending there is ends up being directed somewhere or another for political reasons rather than doing anything useful. All right. Any questions, comments, or thoughts? Interestingly, one conclusion one could draw from this is that what this suggests is that maybe fiscal policy is undesirable because, except for automatic stabilizers, because it's slow. Whereas monetary policy isn't slow. Monetary policy is something that you could change with a snap of your finger almost. Well, not you, but the Fed. So, for example, I'm sure many of you heard about the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank a few weeks ago. And so within days, what happened? There was a concern that the failure of that bank, which actually experienced a run, a literal run with people actually standing around in lines outside of their branches, there was a concern that those bank runs might spread to other similarly sized banks. And so the Fed, within a week, got together with the FDIC and a bunch of other entities and said, okay, in order to keep financial markets calm, we're going to raise the limit on the extent to which deposits are insured, at least for certain kinds of banks. So they could act immediately. They didn't need to go through Congress, they didn't need to argue with anyone, they just brought everyone into the same room and hashed out a plan. Another example, in 2008, as some of you probably know, the banking crisis, the financial crisis of 2008 was initiated, or I guess exploded, when this entity called Lehman Brothers collapsed. And Lehman Brothers experienced a run. Its customers weren't people like you and me, its customers were other financial institutions, but essentially they experienced a run and they collapsed, well, because they were insolvent. And the New York Times headline from that day said something like, Lehman Brothers collapses, and in the same headline it said, Fed lowers discount rate. So we'll discuss eventually why lowering the discount rate might have been an appropriate action to take at that time. But the point is they acted immediately because they can. Unlike the fiscal entity that has to get the representatives of New Jersey and Pennsylvania and so on to agree on something. Worse, they might be from different parties. In which case, good luck getting them to agree on anything. These days, at least. There was a time when people from different parties would disagree and then try and find a compromise. Lately, things have been more polarized, so I would expect worse delays going forward. So any questions, comments about all this? There is one more theoretical, I guess, concern that economists have about the effectiveness of fiscal policy. I did mention this. I'm going to mention it again because it's something that is a bit tricky. And that is what the book calls the Ricardo-Barro effect. It's unfortunate that it has this name because this name doesn't really tell you anything about what it is. Whereas crowding out kind of gives you an idea of what the problem is. Right? So the government is sort of crowding out other borrowers, and thus their spending. The Ricardo-Barro effect has to do with the idea that, well, let's stick with crowding out. Whenever the government tries to push the demand curve back by either of these three means, it necessarily has to borrow. And right now, the government borrowing more makes it compete with other borrowers, so it raises interest rates and decreases other people's spending. But the Ricardo-Barro effect is it takes that idea and looks into the future. What do I mean by that? If the government is borrowing more now, someday it'll have to pay it off. And how is the government going to pay off this extra borrowing? Actually, it not only has to pay off this extra borrowing, it has to pay off this extra borrowing plus interest. That means that someday in the future, they'll have to decrease government spending, or decrease transfers, or increase taxes. In other words, if you're trying to stimulate now, someday in the future, you'll have to do the opposite. And the idea of the Ricardo-Barro effect is that forward-looking individuals or entities know that. So they know that, let's say, for example, lower taxes now means higher taxes in the future. And so you have more income now, but you don't spend it, you actually save it because you know you're going to need it to pay off future higher taxes. So that's another ding against the effectiveness of fiscal stimulus. Not only are you crowding out other borrowers / spenders now, but in addition, you're signaling that later in the future you're going to have a larger debt that you're going to somehow have to pay off. And that, I think, raises further questions about the desirability or even sustainability of using fiscal policy to try and deal with this kind of problem, deal with a short-run, in this case, recessionary gap, because of the following. Suppose we're in a recessionary gap, and whether you're a person or a representative, consider the following. If you're in a recessionary gap, do you think these three things would be politically feasible? Probably, right? You could probably voters would understand that, if we're, let's think of an example when COVID hit and there was a huge hit to higher demand. Something unusual happened. Both parties in Congress agreed to a mega stimulus. Actually, twice. First, let's just go with the first one, where I think both houses of Congress were in Democratic hands, and I think the president was Republican. They nonetheless managed to really quickly agree on $2 trillion of fiscal stimulus of different kinds. So that shows when the economy is doing badly, you might be able to, even in these polarized times, get everyone to agree that something has to happen to try and deal with the economic crisis. But now, imagine sometime in the future when someone says, okay, it's time to pay off the debt, and so we have to either cut government spending or cut transfers or increase taxes for everyone. Is that going to be politically feasible? I'm not so sure. Because that means the government is taking something away from someone. And it probably won't go down well. In other words, using fiscal stimulus to deal with recessions is probably something that's going to happen. It's something that people will agree is needed. But doing the opposite, whether it's to deal with an inflationary gap or to deal with extra debt so that it doesn't go bad, is less politically feasible. So that suggests that being ready to provide fiscal stimulus without the ability to then rein it back later means the debt will just get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And if the debt is really large, and I mean the government, what can happen? Well, one possibility is that the government defaults on its debt. If the government defaults on its debt, what would happen? There'd be the mother of all financial crises. All the banks in the United States hold large amounts of government bonds. The government defaults on them and they become worthless. All the banks are insolvent. What else could happen? well. The other thing is, again, if the debt is too large, the government has to do the opposite of this at some point, which might be politically infeasible. The third thing that could happen is the following. Notice that, let's say, the US government debt right now is, I think, around $30 trillion. Is that a lot? It's a large number, but whether $30 billion is a lot or not depends on the value of a dollar. So another thing that could happen is, well, what if there's inflation at some point between now and whenever the debt has to be paid back? Well, then those $30 trillion maybe aren't worth that much in actual real terms. But if inflation comes along and erodes the real burden of the debt because that's what inflation does, that would also be screwing over all the people who lend to the government, right? Because they'll be being paid back in worthless dollars. So excessive debt is not something from which there's any easy way out. And political reality suggests that there's some risk here, always being ready to stimulate, but never really doing the opposite. It is time for you know what. First question. Using the government budget to stabilize the economy is called what? Of course, it's fiscal policy. Next. The direct impact of an increase in transfers is here the I means disposable income. Higher disposable income, which raises consumption. The indirect impact of an increase in transfers is what? Crowding out. True or false? Most changes in fiscal policy can be implemented Of course, the answer is they're very slow. Thank you, government. Fiscal policy that doesn't require a government decision is a what stabilizer? It is an automatic stabilizer. And last but not least, in a recession, an example of an automatic stabilizer is what? Transfer that rises. Very good. All right. Hope that was useful. Let's see how we get. Third is Parker. Well, What am I saying?